He saved her farm from the raiders, but her father called that salvation a debt to be paid in blood. Thea Marrow stood in the doorway of her father's ranch house, the air heavy with the smell of dust and wood smoke. Outside, the desert wind carried the last breath of daylight across the dying land. Inside, silence hung like a sentence waiting to be read aloud. Her father, Abner Marrow, stood near the hearth, his back straight, his jaw locked in stubborn pride. Across the room stood the man who had saved them. Elias Crow, half Apache, half ghost, his presence filling the small house with something sharp and unspoken. Thea's hands trembled at her sides. She didn't fear Elias. She feared what her father's words were about to do to both of them. Abner's voice cut through the silence like a blade drawn too slowly from its sheath. "You'll marry him, Thea. A man who saves a family deserves to own it." Thea turned to him, disbelief tightening her chest. "Father, no." Elias didn't move, but his eyes lifted steady, unreadable, filled with the kind of strength that didn't need to prove itself. His words came low and even, meant for Abner, but echoing through Thea's bones. "I didn't save her to be rewarded with her chains." Abner's mouth twisted, but he said nothing. The sound of the wind pressed against the windows, a long moaning breath that carried sand through the cracks in the frame. For a moment, none of them moved. Thea felt the world tighten around her, the walls, the dust, the weight of her father's honor. What had begun as gratitude was turning into a prison, and the man who had once been her savior now stood bound to her by a decision neither of them had chosen. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, though no rain had fallen in months. And inside that house, 3 souls stood caught between duty and freedom, one bound by pride, one by debt, and one by a love she didn't yet understand. The Marrow Ranch lay in a basin of cracked earth and stubborn mesquite, a place where the wind spoke in a dry whisper and the sun walked the ridgelines like a tired sentinel. The creek that once braided silver through the pasture had thinned to a brown ribbon, slow as a dying vein. Fences leaned, gates squealed. The cattle that remained wore their ribs like badges, drifting from shade to shade as if shadows could feed them. Thea Marrow moved through it all with a patience she had learned the hard way. Before dawn, she hauled water until the wooden yokes bit her shoulders raw. By noon, she was in the corral, mending splintered rails with hands that had forgotten softness. Evening meant grain tallies that never added up, then lantern light over a ledger that felt more like a confessional than a book of numbers. When she finally reached her bed, she lay still and listened to the house breathing around her. The tick of the mantel clock, the slow settling of old timbers, the dry rasp of wind under the door. Abner Marrow kept his own rituals. He rose early and dressed in the same Sunday shirt, as if dignity could be ironed into cloth. He walked the fence line with a rifle that never left his shoulder. He stood at the western fence and faced the far hills like a man keeping an appointment with a god who had stopped answering. "Trials refine a soul," he would say, not to his daughter but to the horizon, as if the land itself owed him an explanation. And in the silence that followed, Thea heard the rest of the sentence hiding inside his breath. Debts must be honored. There were fewer riders on the county road as the drought dragged on. A peddler now and then, a preacher looking for ears, a drifter or two, silhouettes salted with dust, their hats low, their eyes averted. Most of the ranch hands had gone when the second well failed. Neighbors stopped calling when the 3rd month bled into the 4th. It was easier, Thea thought, to let a place die if you didn't have to watch it happen. On the day the line of fate bent, the heat pressed down like a palm on the crown of the valley. Thea was closing the barn, throat raw with thirst, when she heard hoofbeats that did not sound like neighbors. 7 riders came out of the mirage, sunburnt shapes that sharpened into men with hats pulled low and hunger setting their mouths. They rode a straight line across the property boundary as if the fence were a rumor, as if rules were a luxury that water had washed away. Thea's breath shortened. She set the latch with fingers that wouldn't stay steady and ran for the house. The porch boards boomed under her boots. Abner stepped out with the rifle already in his hands, the skin at his temple shining with sweat. He did not look at her. He looked at the men. The riders reined in 10 paces from the porch. The lead man slid down, boots scuffing the hardpan. He did not introduce himself. He pointed his chin toward the corral. "Half your stock," he said, the cadence flat and practical, like a foreman giving orders to a crew. "No coin. No bargaining. You want trouble, we brought enough." You want to live, you'll open the gate. Thea felt the tilt of the world, then a small, awful shift. Abner's barrel dipped. His jaw worked, and the words that usually came so easily, honor, duty, name, went somewhere she could not follow. He was casting about for a way to bend without breaking, and she could not bear to see him do either. From the direction of the stricken creek, a figure stepped into the open. He walked with a quiet the land seemed to recognize. Coat faded by sun, hair bound back, boots stained the color of distance. He crossed the yard without hurry, feet whispering over the powder-dry soil, and came to a stop in the space between the porch and the riders, as if he had always belonged there. Elias Crow did not touch the weapon on his hip. He measured the distance to each horse, each man, and then let his gaze settle on the one who had spoken. Leave this place. A chuckle slid out from under the lead man's hat brim. His hand flirted with the butt of his revolver. A small theater, meant to teach a lesson. The next second was a hinge. The man shifted, the stranger moved, and the gun that had been holstered was somehow on the ground. The lead man stumbled back, blinking as if the desert had played a trick. Elias did not advance. He only looked at the others, and the silence that followed made it plain that the mathematics of the moment had changed. A rider at the rear spat, turned his mount, and the rest rolled with him like a wave drawing backward. They left without farewell, without promise, without the last insult men usually toss when pride has been bruised. Dust hung where they had been, a ghost that took its time to disappear. Abner lowered the rifle all the way now. His eyes found Elias as if seeing a vision. He was not a man given to awe, but there was awe in him then, the kind that mistakes rescue for revelation. You saved what's mine, he said, voice roughened by something too old to name. My land, my life, my blood. Elias's mouth moved, not quite a smile. I was passing through. That's all. Thea studied him in the hush that followed. Not the speed in his hands, though, that had been terrifyingly clean, but the stillness after. He did not bask. He did not boast. He did not ask if they were all right. He only looked to the creek, as if the water had been the thing he had come here to protect. Night drew its shawl over the basin. Thea lit the lamp and watched its small flame take hold. The house smelled of tallow and old cedar. Across the table, Abner sat straighter than she had seen in weeks, eyes bright in a way that warned her more than any threat. The ledger lay closed between them like a sealed judgment. He will stay for supper, Abner said, tone brooking no reply. Then, softer to the air, as if speaking to the ghosts in the rafters, a man does not walk away from a debt like this. Elias came when called. He ate with the economy of someone who has counted meals and found them wanting. He answered Abner's questions about trails and weather with as few words as possible. When Thea cleared the plates, he stood to help, then stopped himself, as if mindful of borders he could not see. At the door he paused. Tomorrow I ride at first light. Abner's chair scraped. First light comes too soon for a man whose work's not finished. Elias considered the old man, then the woman who had watched him as if he were both danger and relief. His nod held no promise. It only acknowledged that morning would come and bring with it choices none of them had yet faced. Long after he had taken a bedroll by the empty bunkhouse, Thea sat on the porch steps and studied the dark. The stars looked close enough to bruise. Somewhere beyond the far fence, a night bird called, and the cry lifted the hairs on her arms. She drew her knees to her chest and tried to name the feeling that had taken up residence behind her ribs. Gratitude did not cover it. Fear did not either. It felt like standing at the lip of a canyon whose depth you could not see, knowing you would have to cross it without a bridge. Inside, Abner paced the kitchen, a man measuring something heavy he intended to carry alone. She heard him stop, heard the soft, firm tap of knuckles against the table, as if sealing a pact with himself. At dawn, she woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of his voice calling her to the front room. Elias stood by the window, dust already on his coat, the light making a dark coin of his profile. Abner's face bore the calm of men who have decided that a cliff is a road if you only keep walking. You saved a house, he said, eyes on Elias, and the only clean way to square that ledger is with family. Thea felt the canyon open under her feet. The ledger on the sideboard might as well have been a marriage book. The wind rose, carrying the scent of distant rain that would not arrive. She met Elias's eyes and found in them the same recognition that had startled her the night before. Not desire, not even gratitude, but a hard refusal to let pride in another man's chest decide the shape of their lives. He looked away first, jaw set, the fight already coiling in him. By noon, the rumor would be riding ahead of them through the valley. By evening, neighbors would bring their judgments folded in their pockets, and by the third sunrise, Abner Marrow would lay his hand over theirs and call it honor. Thea stood very still and listened to the clock count the seconds down. 3 dawns later, the valley woke under a sky of pale brass, the kind that promised heat without mercy. Thea stood at the kitchen counter, pouring the first coffee of the morning when her father's boots began to echo across the floorboards, slow, deliberate, like the footsteps of a man walking towards something final. He was dressed in his cleanest shirt, the same one he'd worn at her mother's funeral. His beard was trimmed, his eyes clear. For the first time in months, he looked alive. It frightened her more than anything. Abner's voice came steady, almost ceremonial. "I spoke to the preacher from Yuma by telegram. He'll arrive by week's end." Thea blinked, the cup in her hand trembling. "For what?" Abner didn't answer. He turned toward the window where Elias Crow stood outside near the corral, tightening the strap on his horse's saddle. "To make things right," he said finally. The words hung between them, heavy and wrong. Thea stepped closer, searching her father's face for the man she'd known, but found only the preacher's iron, the soldier's pride, the father who believed that control was the same as love. "Father, you can't," he cut her off with a raised hand. "He saved our land, our lives. There are debts that can't be repaid with coin." Thea's breath caught. Her throat burned with words that wouldn't come. "You think marrying me is payment?" Abner's eyes softened for a heartbeat, then hardened again. "I think it's the only way the scales stay balanced." The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, Elias finished tightening his saddle. He was preparing to ride. Thea set the cup down before her hands could betray her. "Then pay him with cattle. Pay him with land. With anything but me." Abner's jaw clenched. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." When she didn't answer, he stepped toward the door. "I already sent word. He's staying. You'll both understand in time." The screen door snapped shut behind him, and for a moment all she could hear was the soft hiss of boiling coffee and her own heartbeat in her ears. Elias was still there when she stepped onto the porch. He turned as she approached, his expression cautious, his posture that of a man waiting for a storm he couldn't stop. "He's not letting you leave," she said, her voice thin but steady. "He thinks this is how to pay you back." Elias looked past her toward the horizon, his jaw flexing. "That's not a debt I want." He reached for the reins, but Abner's voice rang out from the doorway behind her. "You'll stay, Crow. A man doesn't walk away from what's owed to him." Elias turned, meeting the older man's eyes. "And what if I don't want what's owed? Then you'll take it anyway." The air between them thickened, the space too small for the three of them and the weight of those words. Thea stepped between them. "Stop, both of you. You're talking about my life like it's a field to be divided." Neither man spoke. Then Elias broke the silence. "I didn't save her to collect her like a wage." Abner's face flushed. "A man who denies an honest debt has no honor." "Honor," Elias said quietly, "is knowing when to let go." For the first time, Abner faltered. His mouth opened, then shut again. He turned away, muttering something under his breath about duty and sacrifice as he disappeared back inside. Elias exhaled, his shoulders lowering a fraction. "You should leave," she whispered, "before he finds another way to chain you here." Elias shook his head slowly. "If I go, he'll find someone worse to take my place." Thea stared at him, the realization heavy and sudden. "You'd stay to protect me from my own father?" He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes was enough. For a moment, the wind carried a breath of cooler air from the west, a hint of rain that would never come. Thea wanted to believe it was a sign, but she'd lived too long on false promises. Behind them, Abner's shadow fell across the window. 3 days, he said. Thea turned toward Elias, her voice barely a whisper. 3 days until what? Elias's eyes met hers steady, dark, resigned, until he calls it holy. And with that, the first fissure of inevitability split the ground between them. The news spread faster than wildfire in dry grass. By dusk, the whispers had already crossed the valley. The old man from Marrow Ranch was marrying his daughter to a half-blood drifter. By morning, it was no longer a whisper. It was a sentence. Thea heard it first from the store clerk in town, who wouldn't meet her eyes when she came to buy feed. The next came from the preacher's wife, who offered her pity like it was charity. By the time she returned home, a group of riders was already waiting at the gate. Neighbors, men with sun-leathered faces and voices that pretended concern but dripped with judgment. Abner greeted them with forced hospitality, his back stiff, his words measured. He spoke of gratitude and honor, of debts and divine justice. Thea watched from the porch, her heart tightening with each sentence. She could see it in their eyes. They didn't come to reason. They came to warn. The lead rider dismounted, boots crunching in the dust. His name was Garrett Flint, a rancher from the next valley. A man who'd lost more to arrogance than drought but never learned from either. "We heard about your arrangement, Abner," he said, loud enough for Thea to hear. "You're setting a dangerous example." Abner folded his arms. "My family, my decisions, not when it disgraces the rest of us. A man like him." Garrett's eyes flicked toward Elias, who stood by the barn, silent. "Still, a man like that doesn't belong among decent folk." Thea stepped forward before her father could speak. "You mean a man who saved our lives doesn't belong?" Garrett's expression darkened. "You don't understand what you're giving up, Miss Marrow. Your father's name, your mother's legacy." Thea's hands curled into fists. "A name means nothing if it's used to chain me." Murmurs rippled through the group. Garrett's jaw twitched. "You're young, girl. You think defiance makes you free. But freedom built on shame doesn't last." Before Thea could answer, Elias moved. He stepped from the shadow of the barn, walking toward them with the kind of calm that made men nervous. His eyes locked on Garrett's, not with threat, but with something colder: disappointment. "She doesn't need me to defend her," he said evenly. "She just needs you to leave." Garrett laughed, the sound sharp and brittle. "You think this is your land now?" "No," Elias said. "I think you forgot how to be a man." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. The other riders shifted, their hands hovering near their weapons, but none drew. Something in Elias's stillness held them. Garrett's pride cracked first. He spat in the dirt, swung onto his horse, and turned to Abner. "When this goes wrong, don't expect a hand from any of us." He looked at Thea, his voice lowering. "And you, girl, one day you'll regret mistaking defiance for love." They rode off, leaving a trail of dust that glittered cruelly in the fading light. Abner stood motionless for a long time, the echo of their departure lingering in the air. Then, slowly, he turned to Elias. "You shouldn't have interfered." Elias met his gaze. "I didn't interfere. I stopped them from humiliating your daughter." Abner's voice hardened. "You think you understand this land? You think saving us once makes you one of us?" Elias's tone stayed calm. "I don't want to be one of you." Thea stepped between them before her father could reply. "Enough. You both think you're fighting for honor, but you're only breaking what's left of this family." Neither spoke, but the damage was already done. The air between them was poisoned with pride and guilt. That night, the house was silent except for the slow ticking of the clock and the restless sighs of the wind. Thea stayed awake, sitting by the window, staring at the dark outline of the barn where Elias had taken his bedroll. She thought of the way he had stood beside her in front of the others, not as a protector, not as a claimant, but as an equal. For the first time, she realized she didn't just owe him gratitude. She owed him her truth. The next afternoon, she found him near the creek, where the water still shimmered faintly under the sunday. He sat on a flat rock, silent, his fingers turning a small silver coin over and over between them. She approached quietly, stopping a few feet away. "You could leave," she said. "He can't stop you." Elias didn't look at her. "And what happens to you when I'm gone? I'll manage." He turned then, meeting her gaze. "He'll find someone else. Someone who won't care if you say no." Thea swallowed hard. "Why do you care?" Elias's eyes drifted toward the horizon. "Because I know what it's like to lose every choice you ever had." The words settled between them, heavier than any silence. Before she could answer, the sound of distant hooves broke across the wind. Elias rose to his feet in an instant, eyes narrowing. Thea turned toward the sound, a dark line of riders cresting the ridge. Not neighbors this time. The men from before were back, and there were more of them. Elias's hand went to his revolver. His voice was calm, but his eyes told her what she already knew. "They're not here to talk." Thea's pulse hammered. "Then we'd better stop them." Elias looked at her, something fierce flashing behind his calm. "Stay close," he said. Thea nodded, her fear turning to resolve. The sky above them thickened with dust as the riders thundered closer, the ground trembling beneath their hooves, and as the first gunfire cracked through the dry air, Thea realized this wasn't just another raid. It was the reckoning her father's pride had summoned. The first shot shattered the stillness. A bullet split through the porch railing, spraying splinters across Thea's face. She ducked, heart pounding, as the second shot cracked through the air. The riders had come fast, their silhouettes rising and falling in the twilight dust. 12 men now, angry and loud, firing without warning. Elias was already moving. He grabbed Thea's arm, pulling her toward the trough beside the barn. "Stay low," he said, his voice steady even as chaos tore across the yard. Abner stumbled out from the house, rifle in hand. The old man's eyes were wild, his voice raw. "Get inside, Thea." But Thea didn't move. She saw the riders splitting into two groups, one circling the house, one heading for the corral. The herd was their target, the same herd her father had bled for, starved for, prayed for. And she knew he wouldn't let it go again. Abner fired once, the bullet grazing a saddle horn. The raiders answered with a volley. The air filled with smoke and thunder, and the acrid scent of gunpowder burned Thea's throat. Elias dashed toward the barn, using the walls for cover. He moved with practiced precision, never wasting a motion, never shooting unless he was certain. But there were too many of them. Thea's breath came shallow and fast. She lifted her father's old pistol with shaking hands, the same one he'd once taught her to aim at bottles lined along the fence. Her shot went wide, but the noise drew one of the raiders' eyes. He spurred his horse toward her. Elias saw him first. He surged forward, slamming into the man as he leapt from the saddle. They went down hard in the dirt, the raider's blade flashing. Elias grunted, twisted, disarmed him, but not before the knife cut deep across his shoulder. Thea fired again, the sound ringing through her ears. The raider staggered back, scrambling toward his horse. Another burst of gunfire drove him off. The remaining men cut the corral fence, driving the cattle into the open. The ground thundered as hooves tore through the dry soil. Abner shouted, rage breaking through his voice, but his hands were shaking too much to reload. Then, suddenly, silence. The riders vanished into the horizon, taking the herd with them. The dust settled like smoke after battle. Thea stood frozen, pistol still in her hand, her lungs burning. The ranch was a ruin, fences down, the air thick with dust and gun smoke. The barn roof had caught a spark. Flames crawled along the shingles like serpents of light. Elias dropped to one knee beside her, pressing his hand to his bleeding shoulder. "It's over," he said, though they both knew it wasn't. Abner stood in the middle of the yard, rifle dangling at his side, his gaze fixed on the fire. His voice came hoarse and low. "Everything. Gone." Thea turned to Elias, who was breathing heavily but still conscious. She tore a strip from her skirt, pressing it against his wound. "You're hurt." "It's nothing. It's something," she said, her hands firm despite her trembling. Abner dropped to his knees. His rifle hit the ground with a hollow thud. His eyes, clouded with smoke and years, finally cleared. He looked at Elias, then at Thea. "I was wrong," he said, the words scraping out like confession. "All of it. The debt. The pride." Elias sat back against the fence, his breath slow. "You can rebuild a home," he said quietly, "but not with pride as the foundation." Abner's voice broke. "You don't understand. I've done this before." Thea turned sharply. "What are you talking about?" Abner's hands shook. His gaze wandered, like a man lost in memory. "I had another daughter, years before you were born. Her name was Clara, 17 when she ran off with a man I said wasn't worthy. A wanderer. I told her she'd dishonored this family. Told her she was dead to me." He paused, eyes glistening in the firelight. 2 winters later, word came that she'd died. Fever. Her husband tried to bring her home, but no one would help him because of me, because I'd said she wasn't welcome. The silence that followed was deeper than any gunfire. Even the flames seemed to quiet, their crackling softening into a whisper. Abner's shoulders trembled. "I killed my own blood with my pride, and I've been trying ever since to prove that I was right, that obedience and honor were worth the cost. But they weren't." Elias looked at him, his voice low but firm. You can't fix the past by repeating it. Abner's breath hitched. I know. God help me. I know. Thea knelt beside her father, the smell of smoke and ash wrapping around them like grief itself. For the first time, she saw him as something other than the man who ruled her life. She saw him as the man who'd lost everything and didn't know how to stop losing. Elias tried to stand, wincing at the pain in his shoulder. Thea caught his arm, steadying him. You shouldn't move. If I don't, we'll lose the barn, he said, eyes on the growing fire. Abner rose then, voice hoarse but determined. Not this time. He grabbed a bucket from the trough and moved toward the flames. Thea and Elias followed. Together, they threw water until the fire died, smoke curling upward like a final prayer. When it was over, the barn stood blackened but standing like them, scarred yet alive. Abner leaned on his knees, coughing, his voice ragged. I can't lose another daughter. Thea's voice trembled. Then don't try to own this one. He looked up at her, tears cutting lines through the soot on his face. For the first time in her life, Thea saw her father smile not with pride, but with surrender. Night fell like a slow confession. The flames had died, but smoke still hung over the ranch, a thin gray veil drifting between the stars and the broken earth. The air smelled of ash and wet soil, the scent of things destroyed and things about to grow again. Inside what remained of the house, a single lantern burned on the table. Elias sat shirtless, his shoulder wrapped in fresh linen, his skin streaked with dirt and dried blood. Thea worked quietly beside him, washing the last traces of fire from his arms. The light caught in her hair, turning it the color of copper dust. Neither spoke for a while. The silence between them wasn't cold anymore. It was heavy, like two hearts learning to breathe in the same rhythm after too long fighting alone. Abner sat in the corner, hands clasped, face hidden in shadow. His voice came at last, rough and low, as if the night itself had to drag it out of him. I thought honor meant control. I thought I could build a life from obedience. But I see now all I've built is a prison. Thea stopped what she was doing. You can't undo the past, Father. Abner lifted his head. No, but I can stop repeating it. He stood slowly, his body trembling with age and exhaustion. He crossed the room and placed a shaking hand on Elias's shoulder. You owe us nothing. You saved this land and I repaid you with chains. For that, I am sorry. Elias said nothing. He only nodded once, the gesture carrying the quiet gravity of forgiveness neither man could speak. Abner turned to Thea. His eyes, usually hard as flint, were wet and unguarded. I can't lose another daughter to my pride. You're free, Thea. Free from this debt, from this name, from me if that's what you want. Thea's breath caught, and for the first time in years, she saw her father as human, not as the man who dictated her choices, but as the man who was terrified of losing her. Abner stepped back, his voice breaking. I'll tell the preacher not to come. I'll tell anyone who asks that I was wrong. Thea swallowed hard. The word wrong sounded strange coming from him, like a prayer he'd never known how to say. Elias pushed back his chair. I'll be gone by morning, he said quietly. Thea turned to him. You don't have to leave. He shook his head, the shadow of a smile crossing his face. I've stayed too long already. She stood, stepping closer until her knees brushed his. You saved this place twice, once from raiders, once from my father's pride. Don't tell me that means nothing. Elias looked up at her then, his eyes tired but steady. I didn't save you to own you, and I don't want you to, she whispered. I just don't want you to disappear. Abner moved quietly toward the door. He stopped in the threshold, the lamplight glinting off the tears he didn't bother to hide. The two of you don't owe me anything. Not honor, not obedience, not even forgiveness. What you do from here on, that's your story, not mine. Then he stepped outside, leaving them alone in the golden hush of the lantern glow. Thea stood still for a long time, her hands trembling slightly. The weight that had pressed on her since the day the drought began seemed to lift all at once. She looked at Elias, his body worn, his face lined with quiet pain, and realized how strange it was that freedom and love could feel so similar, both terrifying, both fragile, both alive. Elias spoke at last. Tomorrow, I'll ride west. There's open country there. No debts, no names. Thea's voice was soft. Is that what you want? Elias hesitated. It's what I know. She took a breath, her heart steady for the first time in weeks. Then stay not because of what he wanted, but because of what we could choose. Elias's eyes searched hers, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she saw the wall inside him begin to crack. He exhaled slowly, the kind of sigh that carries years of wandering. You really think I could learn how to belong? Thea smiled faintly. Maybe belonging isn't something you learn. Maybe it's something you build. Outside, thunder rumbled a deep, distant promise. Then came the faint patter of rain. Thea turned toward the sound, disbelieving. After all the prayers, all the drought, all the dust, the rain had finally come. Elias stood beside her at the window, the drops tapping against the glass, leaving streaks that shimmered in the lantern light. He watched them for a long time, his voice barely above a whisper. Seems the land forgives faster than we do. Thea looked at him, her lips curling into a quiet smile. Then maybe it's time we start catching up. Spring came slow to the valley. The storms were smaller now, but they stayed longer, gentle rains that sank deep into the cracked earth instead of rolling off it. Green began to creep along the fence lines again, timid at first, then sure of itself. The sound of insects returned to the nights, soft and steady like prayer beads clicking in the dark. The Marrow ranch no longer looked cursed. It looked earned. Elias Crow woke before dawn most days, as he always had. He mended fences, patched roofs, cut firewood. The scars on his shoulder had faded into pale ridges that only itched when the rain came. Sometimes, when the wind rose over the ridge, he'd pause and listen. It still carried the ghosts of old gunfire, the shouts of men long gone, but they no longer haunted him. They had become part of the rhythm of the land echoes, not chains. Thea Marrow walked the fields with him, her skirts brushing the new grass. Her hands had grown rougher, her steps surer. The girl who once lived under her father's shadow now moved like someone who'd learned to measure her own worth against the horizon, not the expectations of men. She laughed more easily now, not the laughter of defiance, but of release. Sometimes, when the sun dipped behind the hills, Elias would catch her standing at the edge of the corral, face tilted toward the light. She looked like someone listening to something only she could hear, a promise, maybe, or just the memory of the moment when everything changed. Abner still lived in the main house, but he no longer ruled it. He spent his days rebuilding what he could, repairing small things no one asked him to fix. His pride, once a mountain, had softened into a quiet hill still there, but easier to climb. When neighbors passed by, they no longer crossed the road to avoid him. Some even stopped to talk. He didn't speak much. He had finally learned the value of silence. One evening, as the last light fell across the porch, Abner sat with Elias. They shared a pot of coffee, neither saying much. The sound of Thea's laughter drifted from the barn, where she was feeding the horses. Abner's hands trembled as he poured another cup. I used to think honor meant never bending, he said quietly. Elias looked toward the horizon. Sometimes bending is the only way not to break. Abner nodded, a faint smile breaking the lines of his face. I wish I'd known that sooner. Elias said nothing, but the look they shared was enough. It wasn't forgiveness, it was understanding, which often comes afterward and cuts deeper. When summer arrived, Thea and Elias stood together at the creek, the same place where he had first appeared out of the dust, where his shadow had fallen between her father and the men who meant to take everything. The water was fuller now, clearer. Thea knelt and let it run through her fingers. Elias crouched beside her. You remember what it looked like before? She nodded. Like it was dying. He smiled faintly. And now? Now it's living the way it should have been all along. Elias watched the current twist around the stones, his voice low. I thought if I kept moving, I could outrun what I'd lost. But maybe standing still is harder and braver. Thea looked at him, her heart catching on the truth in that. Then stay still, she said. Stay with me. He met her eyes, and in that moment, the years of distance in him fell away. He reached out, his rough hand brushing the back of hers. The gesture was small, but it held more weight than any vow. Behind them, the sun sank into the ridgeline, painting the land gold. The smell of rain drifted in from the west. Later that night, as thunder rolled softly over the plains, Elias and Thea stood on the porch beside Abner. The three of them watched the rain fall across the fields, slow, steady, endless. Abner leaned on the railing, his voice barely above a whisper. You were right, Thea. Honor isn't about paying debts. It's about what you build when the debts are gone. She turned toward him, eyes shining in the dim light. Then we're building something worth keeping. Abner nodded once. For the first time in years, peace crossed his face. Not pride, not regret, just peace. When he went to bed, Elias and Thea stayed on the porch. The rain kept falling, the same soft rhythm that had begun the night their chains broke. Elias reached for her hand, and she let him hold it. Neither spoke. There was no need. The land had already said everything that mattered. In the distance, the creek swelled and whispered. The storm passed gently over them, washing away the last traces of ash, leaving only clean earth and the scent of something new. And when morning came, the valley was green again. In the west, every debt has a price, but some are repaid not in blood or duty, but in the quiet courage to choose love when freedom finally comes.